Before we get into today's topic, I want to invite you to something. Not to sell you anything, not to convince you of anything, but to open a space, right here, right now, where you can truly listen to yourself. Because what we're going to talk about isn't light, it isn't obvious, and it might touch a place you've never had the courage to go. But before that, take a deep breath and think, what's your story with your father? Was he present? Was he absent? Did he ever look you in the eyes and tell you that you were enough? Or was there just silence where there should have been words? You don't need to answer now, but if an image popped up inside, keep it with you. And if you want, share it in the comments. Sometimes saying what's been kept inside is the first step toward transformation. And who knows, maybe your story can help someone who's been carrying the same weight in silence. Take the opportunity to subscribe here, not just to receive more content like this, but to be part of something bigger, a community of people who think, feel, and rebuild themselves. Because there are wounds that only start to heal when we realize we're not alone. And this one, the absence of a father, is one of the deepest a person can carry. Maybe you've never thought much about it. Maybe you've buried it deep down. Or maybe you've gotten so used to the absence that you don't even realize how much it still affects your decisions, your relationships, your way of living. The truth is, many people go through life trying to make up for a void they never knew how to explain. And today we're going to talk about that, but not in a theoretical or distant way. The idea here is to dive in, to face this silence head-on, to understand what it does to us. And more than that, to find out if it's possible to turn that absence into a new kind of presence. It won't be easy, but it might be necessary. So stay until the end, because there, maybe, is the answer you've been looking for years, even without knowing it. There are absences that don't make noise but shape everything. Growing up without a father, whether through abandonment, emotional distance, or even a faded presence, leaves marks that we don't always understand right away. Aristotle knew this. For him, the father wasn't just a provider or head of the family, but an essential figure in the formation of character. He was the one who taught by example what virtue is. And when that's missing, it's not just a person that's missing. It's direction, it's a mirror, it's solid ground. A lot of people try to fill that void with strength, success, independence. But inside, they carry a constant feeling of improvising, as if there's no map. And it's no exaggeration. A father's absence affects how we see ourselves, how we trust others, how we seek affection. Sometimes it turns into insecurity, sometimes into rigidity, sometimes into a blind need to prove something to someone, even without knowing who. Aristotle said that goodness is learned, that no one is born virtuous, we are shaped. And if that shaping begins with an absent figure, what's left is a solitary effort to become whole. That effort at times becomes a burden. And when it's not addressed, it repeats, it spreads. A father's absence today still lives in many, not as a memory, but as a structure. And understanding that is the first step toward breaking the silence and starting to write a different story. In Aristotle's view, the father was not just the beginning of biological life, he was the starting point of ethical life. He believed that no one is born ready to live well. Excellence, or arete, is cultivated. And that cultivation begins at home, with those who offer the first examples of decision, courage, and justice. The father, in this context, symbolizes more than authority. He embodies the practical model of virtue. And what is virtue, after all? It is the habit of choosing the middle ground between excess and deficiency. It is knowing when to act with firmness and when to yield with wisdom. This balance is not learned from books. It is learned by living with someone who practices it. Someone who, through their actions, teaches what is truly worthwhile. Without this reference, a child grows up like someone trying to dance without music. They may move, but with uncoordinated steps, full of inner noise. And this goes beyond behavior. It affects the structure of moral judgment, the ability to make decisions, to uphold values in the face of the world. What Aristotle proposed was an ethics of formation, a morality that is not imposed, it is built. And that building requires coexistence, repetition, observation. The father, by acting with wisdom, generosity, or courage in the face of life's challenges, silently teaches what those words mean. Because virtue is not an abstract concept. It is the body in action. It is gesture, it is constant attitude. When that presence is missing, what settles in is an empty space, not just in the heart, but in moral reasoning. The child grows up making decisions based on instinct, necessity, or rebellion, unable to build a firm sense of what is good. And that fragility later expresses itself in various ways: difficulty assuming responsibilities, resistance to authority, or even excessively rigid behavior. As if, having never seen an example of balance, they try to compensate with harshness. The absence of a father, in this sense, is not just a lack of affection, it is a break in ethical formation. That's why when Aristotle speaks of the importance of habits in building the moral soul, he is indirectly speaking of the importance of the one who initiates those habits. The father, or a figure who represents that role, is the first compass, and when that compass fails, the inner needle spins endlessly. Some children try to find substitutes: a teacher, a leader, an older friend. Others go it alone, like someone walking in the dark, learning through pain. But all of them, on some level, carry the mark of that absence, even if they don't know how to name it. The impact isn't immediate, but cumulative. It reveals itself in detours, in crooked choices, in repeated patterns. And behind many lost, insecure, or cold adults, there is a childhood without reference. Aristotle knew that to educate is to shape character, and shaping character begins with a look, the look of someone who, even without words, shows us the way. When that look is missing, an entire life can be lost in search of a mirror that never existed. A father's absence is not just the absence of presence, it's the absence of a mirror. It's like growing up without ever seeing your own face reflected in someone. A child looks to the father for the image of who they might become. It's a model of identity that isn't imposed through words, but transmitted through the way one walks, reacts, protects. When that mirror is broken, or never existed, the child grows up trying to shape themselves from fragments, a bit of what they see in others, a bit of what they imagine, a bit of what they invent just to survive. That collage becomes personality, but without a solid base. And an identity built that way is fragile, unstable, vulnerable to any wind. In boys, this often turns into a silent crisis of masculinity. Either they imitate aggressive caricatures of strength, or they reject any trace of authority for fear of repeating the absence they endured. Girls often grow up without a reference for how to trust a male figure, which leads to fear, idealizations, or repeated patterns of abandonment. This identity fragmentation doesn't just appear in adolescence. It follows into adulthood, infiltrates work, friendships, romantic relationships. Those who had no mirror try to see themselves in the eyes of others, and that dependency becomes a kind of emotional hunger, a chronic need for validation, recognition, unconditional love. But no adult can offer that in the way a child once hoped. And that's where the frustrations, the conflicts, the distancing begin. It becomes a cycle. The more one seeks from others what they never had, the more the feeling of emptiness is confirmed, because what was missing doesn't come back. And if it isn't understood, it continues to drive behaviors on autopilot. Men who don't know how to be fathers because they never saw one, women who avoid attachment for fear of being left, people who confuse attention with love, rigidity with protection. The paternal void becomes a hidden emotional code, repeating itself unnoticed. That's when absence becomes a wound, and like any wound that isn't healed, it closes poorly. It creates defenses, cynicism, sarcasm, self-sufficiency. In some cases, it turns into a complete denial of the father figure, as if the whole world had to pay for that abandonment. In others, it shows up as idealization, a desperate search for a perfect figure to fix the past. But neither strategy works, because what was broken can't be solved with substitutes. It needs to be acknowledged, it needs to be faced. Identity only begins to rebuild when the son or daughter understands that the mirror isn't outside. That, despite the absence, it's possible to form an internal image of one's own, a lighter masculinity, a more humane authority, a confidence that doesn't depend on reproducing what was missing, but on creating something new. The broken mirror is still there, but it can be used as material to build something else, something whole, even with cracks. When the father isn't there, or is there without real presence, something settles into the silence, not a pure emptiness, but a muted noise. An echo of what was never said, never asked, never answered. The child feels the absence but doesn't understand it. They grow up hearing a muffled sound inside themselves, like a note stuck in their chest. And that sound becomes the background music of their relationships. In friendship, it shows up as mistrust. In love, as fear of being left. In adulthood, as difficulty trusting someone enough to truly open up. A father's absence often teaches how to survive alone. And those who survive alone learn not to depend, which later on becomes an inability to form deep connections. The person may love, but they hold back. They get attached, but hide. They seem strong, but live on alert, as if every bond were a threat of repeated abandonment. This emotional pattern tends to repeat itself subtly. Sometimes the person gets involved with someone, and without realizing it, reproduces the same distance they once lived. They become absent, avoid hard conversations, disappear emotionally when the other needs them most. Other times the opposite happens. They become controlling, suffocating, excessively needy, because they fear losing again, like they did before. These are unconscious attempts to resolve an emotional hole with people who have no responsibility for it. But what's at stake runs deeper. It's the attempt to create in the present the presence that was missing in the past. But no partner can fill that role. What was lived in childhood needs to be acknowledged by the one who lived it. And then comes the hardest part, naming the pain, admitting that it was missing, that it hurt, that it still hurts. This takes courage. Because admitting the absence of a father is like opening a drawer that's been locked your whole life. But it's precisely in that recognition that the possibility of transformation begins. As long as that echo isn't listened to with care, it will keep screaming inside relationships. It will shape decisions, build defenses, block connection. Many people, out of pride or fear, prefer to say, it doesn't matter, that they didn't miss anything, that they learned on their own, that they're even stronger because of it. But the truth is, silence is also a way of screaming, and those who don't face that silence end up passing it on. Children who repeat the distance, partners who live under tension, bonds that break without explanation. What was never said becomes an invisible pattern, and it becomes even more cruel when it recreates the very emptiness one tried so hard to avoid. That's why understanding the relational impact of a father's absence is essential, not to blame the past, but to free the present, so that love stops being survival and becomes connection, so that affection stops being scarce, and can finally breathe. Faced with the void left by an absent father, many grow up with the feeling that they can't count on anyone. And then, a silent impulse is born, to handle everything alone, to be too strong, too responsible, an adult before their time. That's when the child puts on armor and tries to take the place of the one who should have guided them. On the outside, this looks admirable: early maturity, autonomy, grit. But on the inside, it hides an old pain, the pain of never having been cared for. Those who try to be their own father end up demanding something impossible of themselves, to be source, structure, and comfort all at once. It's a silent pressure that drains, because you can't teach yourself what you never learned, and so the person lives in a dilemma. They need support, but don't trust. They want comfort, but shut down. They long for love, but can't ask for it. They remain there in a state of permanent readiness, trying not to fall, as if falling meant losing everything. Aristotle spoke of the danger of extremes. For him, virtue was in the middle, neither the rigidity that pretends not to need anyone, nor the fragility that surrenders to despair. But those who grew up without a father tend to swing between these poles. Either they become hyper-independent, refusing help as if it were weakness, or they get lost trying to fill the past with any present presence. The effort to become one's own father often turns into hardness, a kind of functional coldness. The person handles everything, organizes life, solves problems, but doesn't allow themselves to be vulnerable, because deep down they believe they can't, that if they lower their guard, no one will be there to catch them. And this excess of control becomes a prison. It makes it hard to rest, to trust, to surrender. Life becomes a battlefield where peace feels suspicious. And that constant tension takes a toll. It pushes people away, weakens the body, hardens the heart, all in the name of a strength that deep down is just fear in disguise. Trying to be your own father is not in itself a mistake. It's a noble attempt at survival. But if that movement isn't accompanied by awareness, it turns into self-violence. It's necessary to learn how to take off the armor, to recognize what was missing, and that there's no shame in feeling that. Being strong isn't about never falling, but about knowing when to ask for help. Healing begins when one accepts that they can't go back in time, nor wait for a return that will never come. The father who wasn't there can't suddenly fill the past. But it's possible to build, today, another kind of presence, more internal, more conscious, more gentle. A kind of symbolic fatherhood that doesn't demand perfection but offers direction, that embraces the wounded child but also guides the adult who carries on. A literal return may be impossible, but the construction of a new internal compass is not. And that compass begins to take shape when we stop pretending it didn't hurt and finally choose to care for what remains. In many ancient cultures, the role of the father included something that has almost been lost today, guiding the son or daughter through a rite of passage, a symbolic moment, sometimes painful, sometimes solemn, in which the child was led into adult life. This gesture wasn't just a formality, it was a recognition. And now you can, coming from someone with the authority to say it. Aristotle, though he spoke in philosophical terms, also pointed to this transition, the passage from paideia to phronesis, from passive formation to active wisdom. When this rite doesn't happen, emotional growth gets suspended. A person can age, take on responsibilities, even seem mature. But inside they remain in limbo, still waiting for someone to say, "You are enough. Now it's your turn." And that waiting, when unmet, turns into chronic insecurity, into fear of deciding, into avoidance of real maturity. Without that emotional initiation, many adults continue waiting for permission to fully exist. They accumulate titles, achievements, degrees, but can't feel ready, because there was no one back then who truly looked at them and said, "You can trust yourself." This creates a subtle dependency, the constant search for external validation, for someone to say everything's okay, that the path is right. And while that voice doesn't appear, or appears in distorted forms, the person drags on, avoids hard decisions, delays important choices, lives in waiting mode. Others react in the opposite way. They try to constantly prove they're already mature. They become overly serious, controlling, demanding of themselves. But behind the rigidity still lives that child who was never initiated, who never received a look of trust, and that absence weighs. It becomes an internal silence that screams at every challenge of adult life. What happens then is that this transition, which should be symbolic, relational, guided, ends up becoming solitary. Those who had no rite of passage try to force one, going through unnecessary trials, testing their own limits, seeking approval where there is no affection. Sometimes they throw themselves into toxic relationships, extreme challenges, overloaded routines, all as an unconscious way of proving something. But emotional initiation isn't born from suffering alone. It's born from recognition, from the meeting between the one who guides and the one who receives. And when that meeting never happened, the only path is to rebuild it internally, to accept that there was no external yes, and to decide with courage to give that yes to oneself. Not out of vanity, but out of liberation. Because in the end, the greatest rite of passage is the one in which we choose to stop waiting for someone and begin to become who we can, in fact, be. The absence of a father, when unacknowledged, grows inside like a shadow. It doesn't matter your age, circumstances, or achievements. If that emptiness isn't faced head-on, it keeps guiding life from the edges. And it's precisely because it's invisible that it hurts so much. Because it has no name, no shape. And often the person convinces themselves that everything is fine, until they realize that on some level, they're always waiting for something that never came. Healing that isn't about forgetting or pretending it didn't matter. It's about accepting that it did, that it hurt, and that even so, something new can still be built now. Aristotle said that a good life requires awareness, and awareness begins with a brave look inward. A father's absence can be a wound, but it can also be the starting point for deeper transformation. Turning that absence into symbolic presence isn't about replacing the one who left. It's about becoming who was missing, with tenderness, without rushing, with patience. It's about learning to find your way even without a compass, to comfort yourself even without ever having been comforted. That doesn't mean denying the pain, but integrating it. Making it part of your story, without shame, without victimhood, without hardness. A father's absence doesn't need to remain an invisible prison. It can become a seed, a call to break the cycle, to raise children with more presence, to love with more awareness, to live with more depth. When we choose to be the foundation we never had, we don't erase the past, but we plant something new in the present. And that act, no matter how quiet, is revolutionary. So if this topic touched something in you, a memory, a question, a wound that may have never been named, share it in the comments. Your experience may resonate with someone going through the same thing, and if this conversation made you think in a new way, if it helped you understand a bit more about yourself or someone close to you, subscribe, because here, each topic is more than just content. It's a meeting point. And we continue on together, trying to heal what never had a name, and building with courage what can still bloom.